And joining us now on our book talk segment, author of a book that I think a lot of people deal with in their diet and answers some questions on that. It's called Grain of Truth, The Real Case For and Against Wheat and Gluten. We're joined today by Stephen Yafa on the telephone. And Stephen, good to talk with you. How are you today?
I'm pretty good, thank you, Doc. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well. Yeah, I guess you kind of touched a nerve on this particular book. I guess you've written about it before as well. You had other books called Grain Brain and Wheat Belly, but the last, I guess, 10 or 15 years, you hear a lot about what's going on in the world of particularly with gluten and diet and all that. So I guess a lot of people are affected by it, right?
Well, you know, as many as 35% of Americans at this point are concerned about gluten in their diet and basically are either trying to get off gluten or already have, even though best guess by clinical testing and so forth is that at the very most 6% of the population might have any real issues with gluten.
Yeah, I never heard of it as a kid. They always said, eat bread, and wheat and bread are good for you. Wheaties cereal, breakfast of champions and all that. But is gluten different now than it used to be, or what made it kind of become an issue the last 10 or 15 years?
Good question. Some of the books, including Wheat Belly, suggest that gluten has mutated in the last 50 years or so, but all the plant geneticists I talk to, and I write about this in my book, tell me that isn't so, nor is the amount of gluten in wheat. Gluten, by the way, is a protein, really two proteins, gliadin and glutenin, that allow bread to rise and hold its shape. The amount of that percentage has remained very, very similar from, early on in the 20th century, so it really hasn't changed dramatically at all.
Yeah, because you didn't hear a lot of people having, like celiac problems, unable to digest it and that kind of thing until more recent year. I just wonder if anything changed in the processing of wheat to make that, happen.
Well, processing is an interesting subject that I go into at some length in my book, and I visited, large industrial bakeries, Bimbo's, which is the largest in the country, the bakery that does Oro Wheat, Arnold's, and Sara Lee, and maybe 15 other brands. These bakeries have become so efficient they can turn out loaves of bread in 4 hours from beginning to end. That's right, from making the dough all the way through baking it, packaging it, and getting it out the door. For fermentation, that's a huge shortcut from the actual process and how long nature intended fermentation to take when it comes to grain, which is at least 2 days. And when you do sourdough breads, you're actually encouraging lactic fermentation, lactic acid. Lactic acid is extremely beneficial for you, and that process cuts right through the gluten molecules that are difficult to digest. But when you process grain, wheat, for example, which is has the highest content of gluten of all grains, when you cut through that process and try to shortcut it, you create products that are edible, but they're not necessarily really doing the job of putting it out there in its best form. So, we're kind of victims of that technology in many ways. Those advances don't necessarily respond to the way that we best treat our bodies.
I remember when Grandma would bake a loaf of bread. You put the yeast in it, let it rise, and it would be an all-day, or maybe sometimes, like you said, a 2-day affair, right? to get it done right.
Exactly. And I've been doing that at home. I've been doing that at home for over a year now since I started writing this book. And hey, I actually find it to be fun to do this. And I have to tell you that the sourdough bread, whole wheat sourdough bread I've been making has actually turned out purely by chance to also result in a weight loss of 10 pounds. So go figure.
Wow, that's pretty good.
Yeah, so who knows why. But it's true. The way that our bodies absorb these probiotics from lactic fermentation is extremely beneficial, and the fiber that results from that gives us a sense of being filled up. So I find that I'm not snacking at all between meals the way that I would normally do.
Yeah, sourdough. I've always enjoyed sourdough bread or sourdough rolls and that kind of thing. And that's, you talk a lot about it in the book, like you just mentioned. So it's the process of fermentation that obviously gives it that little different flavor, right? But it also makes the gluten more, digestible. Is that what it does on top of it?
Yeah, exactly. Basically, the gluten molecules get divided up and they get scissored. Really, if you looked at it, it would be like a tangled web of molecules together, gliadin and glutenin. And you look at lactic acid fermentation, essentially like a scissors or a knife chemically that cuts right through those huge molecules into smaller parts, which make it much more digestible.
You see so much now in food advertising or in the food store, gluten-free on the package label, but that's not necessarily something people have to do, right? I mean, like you said, if you can tolerate the sourdough,
No,
that's better for you.
I highly recommend that people do not fall prey to gluten-free foods by and large because they're filled with carbohydrates that are possibly even worse for you than refined white flour. I'm not a champion of refined white wheat flour or processing. I'm talking really about whole wheat and those benefits. But when you start eating non-gluten foods, if you turn the package over, you're certainly going to be eating tapioca, starch, potato flour, rice flour, whatever, and they don't really deliver much nutrition. They're almost like a sure express train going, right into your system as glucose, which is going to spike your bloodstream sugar levels.
You talk about it in the book as well. You visited a lot of different, I guess, micro millers. I don't know if that's the right term for it, but smaller granaries and stuff. That must have been kind of interesting.
It's very interesting. It's a little bit like the organic movement in the 70s, where it started out in farmers markets. Nobody knew much about it. And then people started to sample these foods and say, hey, this is cool. Well, it turns out around this country there are a lot of stone millers who are now milling in the old-fashioned stone milling way, local grains, and delivering really terrific products to local artisan bakers. And even if they're getting some of their wheat elsewhere, they're starting to bake and mill in a way that really harks back to a time when there was much more nutrition in the final product than there is today.
Do you find, I guess, from your perspective, a lot of people are doing this, going to the smaller, bakeries and millers and that kind of thing? Is that a stone wall though with the big bakeries, the big corporate ones that to change that over, or how do you see that shaking out?
Well, you know what? I think there's a campaign to be made here, and I started a campaign called Sourdough for All because I think that this should not be a question of price or individual privilege. You may not have the money to spend for $6 a loaf at Whole Foods, for example, for an artisan sourdough. Mm-hmm. And I think that the industrial bakers in this country have really been irresponsible in not offering long fermented sourdough breads at a reasonable price because they're more healthful. And I don't think that nutrition should be a question really of where you are in the economic income scale. I think it should be available to everybody, but by and large it isn't. And the things that are commercially packaged by and large as sourdough really have acid sprayed into them at the last moment, in the baking process. So That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about fermentation that takes, a couple of days, as you were saying about your grandmother's bread,
Right.
It's that you can't really hurry it and come out successfully at the other end.
Yeah, certain things take a certain amount of time to be done right?
Yeah, you can't hurry love and you can't hurry fermentation.
That's right.
So
I mean, a good song. You can't hurry love, or maybe somebody already wrote that.
Yeah, not bad.
Well, the book I'm sure is going to help a lot of people that have been, having dietary issues with wheat and gluten. There's some good news for them. Again, it's called Grain of Truth: The Real Case For and Against Wheat and Gluten. And we've been talking with Stephen Yafa today. And Stephen, I know the book just came out. You want to give a website to get a hold of you, or to get a hold of the book if they like?
Sure. The website for the book is grainoftruthbook.com. My name is Stephen Yafa, STEPHENYAFA, and you can go directly to my site, but they link to one another. And let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from anybody, and I'll answer any questions that I can, for sure.
Great. Stephen, pleasure to talk to you. Good luck with the book, and please keep in touch. I'd like to have you on again down the road sometime, but thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Doug. Much appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
If you'd like to order the book we're talking about, please go to DougMilesMedia.com and enter the author's name in the Amazon search box. Thank you for listening. Please come back soon for more conversations here at DougMilesMedia.com. This has been a presentation of Doug Miles Media, all rights reserved. You can listen to or download previous programs at iTunes, Stitcher.com, or Doug Miles Media.